Hi everyone. So it's windy outside. It's Storm Gerrit, or the tail end of Storm Gerrit. Hopefully, it won't distract the video too much. Um, I've just watched a CNN report on the latest situation in Gaza, and of course, it's grim. I think what's happened with this war is it's become kind of like all wars become after a while, which is people kind of get a bit turned off. It's just more of the same. So when this began on October the 7th, that awful Hamas atrocity, it was big news. This was the start of a new war in the Middle East. It's still major news, but it's a bit like the war in Ukraine in the sense that I think people are becoming wary of the constant grimness of the situation. So it's no longer breaking news, it's just an ongoing, bogged down situation. Um, Without question, this is the most major war between Israel and the Palestinians ever, including the Six Day War and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The death toll has now surpassed both of those. And, I've studied this a little bit. If you look at all the intifadas, all the various clashes, all the uprisings, in my whole lifetime, I was born in 1985 to now, um, more people, or about the same number of people, have died in the last 3 months than that period combined. So it's an exceptionally violent situation. And the vast majority of deaths are on the Palestinian side. Now, I'm going to say it, I think Israel's going too far. And there's an important caveat with this. Well, there's a few caveats. Firstly, I'm not neutral in this conflict. It's not a case of, well, both sides are equally wrong, both sides are equally to blame. I don't see it that way. Without question, this war, I'm talking about the 2023 war, was started by Hamas, without question. They made the decision on a Jewish holiday to brutally attack Israeli civilians, slaughtering hundreds of people, kidnapping many more. There was reports of torture. In fact, there was evidence of torture. Now, those kibbutzes in southern Israel um, tend to be on the Israeli left. That's an interesting thing. This isn't like settlers, not that would be justified either, but these kibbutzes tend to be occupied by people who are on the left of Israeli politics. The point I'm making with that is that people who were targeted are the very people who would be likely critical of Netanyahu and his hard right government. So to Hamas, all Israelis are legitimate targets. That's an important point. Israeli civilians are a legitimate target in their minds. I consider Hamas a vicious terrorist organization. I think they're one of the biggest threats to peace in the region. I don't think they're the only threat to peace, but I think they're one of the biggest threats to peace. Now, when they attacked Israel, which proportionally is a powerful small country, Israel is a small country, but it's comparatively wealthy. It's got very powerful armed forces, comparatively speaking, and of course, it has military and economic funding from the United States and other Western countries. So Hamas was sort of shooting itself in the foot by attacking Israel in that way. And also morally, it was reprehensible. That goes without saying. But I also think that Israel is now basically engaging in collective punishment. And I also think that's indefensible. But this is not a case of saying Israel equals Hamas. One is a sovereign nation, one is a terrorist group. Um, but before I get into, I'm reading a book actually, just started a book. It's called Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid by the former American President Jimmy Carter. Carter now, of course, is a very old man, but he wrote this in 2006. And um, it's quite poignant. It makes for interesting reading. The title might be a little bit contentious. Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. Well, there's two contentious things there. The word Palestine is hotly debated over what exactly it refers to, because the word Palestine, I understand, derives from the ancient Greek, and the Romans used it to designate that province. It has been argued by some Israel supporters that Palestine doesn't really exist it's a historic region. I had sort of swayed to that argument, but it depends how you look at this. I mean, there's translations of the Bible that mention Palestine, but that's English translations, and it may simply be for convenience. I mean, I have a copy of the Bible, and it says there's a map at the back. It says Palestine in the first century. So unquestionably, Palestine is a historic term, but that doesn't mean it's the same as a nation state. I think it's fair to say it's a historic region, which basically corresponds to the Levant, the Near East, or what we might call the Holy Land. This is the problem with conflict in this region. It's such an ancient part of the world. It's where agriculture first began in the world, the Fertile Crescent, and there's all sorts of I think if you go down the lines of who owns the land, it'll be an endless argument. I am a believer that there is a strong, legitimate claim of the Jewish people to that part of the world. Why? Because it's ancient. You look back to the ancient kingdom of Israel, the United Kingdom of Israel. That wasn't fiction. That was a real political entity, and so I do think there is an ancient claim of the Jewish people to that part of the world. Now, the events of the 1940s, the Nakba, as Arabs would call it, remain deeply controversial for obvious reasons. There were Arabs uprooted from their homes, but this notion that the Jews just moved in and they don't have an ancient claim to the land is preposterous. They very clearly do. Even before Islam came about as a faith, that's a reality. I mean, the historic chronology of King David goes back to roughly 1000 BC. Islam was formed in around the mid 6th century or late 6th century. Why does that matter? It matters because when it gets into claims about the land, I don't think Muslims can say there is no Jewish claim to that land. There very clearly is. But that having been said, well, actually, I'll talk about the current situation in a minute, but I'm just going to quote something from Carter's book. The other bit that's contentious is apartheid. That's a very specific term that referred to the situation in South Africa. Now, I don't know if Carter should have picked that term. I respect Jimmy Carter. I think he is an authority on this subject. After all, it was Jimmy Carter who achieved the Camp David Accords of 1978. I would say that was one of the major high points of his presidency. And to this day, Egypt and Israel have not had a war. So, I think he's an authority on the subject. He's visited that part of the world many times, both as president and post-presidency. But this is something interesting that Carter says regarding the peace process. And remember, this was published in 2006, so Netanyahu wasn't in Parliament. I believe it was Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister at that time. It has always been clear that the antagonists cannot be expected to take the initiative to resolve their own differences. So this is Carter being a realist. Hatred and distrust in the Middle East are too ingrained and pride is too great for any of the disputing parties to offer invitations or concessions that they know will almost inevitably be rejected. Accommodation must be sought through negotiation with all parties to the dispute, with each having fair representation and the right to participate in free discussions. Compromise is necessary from both sides, with clear distinctions made between what their dreams and ideology dictate and what is pragmatically possible. Although some extremists disagree, most Israelis have learned that they cannot reconstruct the Kingdom of David, which includes all of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and parts of Lebanon and Jordan. That's the ancient Kingdom of David I was talking about. But it cannot be reconstructed in that ancient form. That's sort of irredentism, and that irredentism will not work in the Holy Land. At the same time, most Palestinians have been forced to accept the fact that the nation of Israel will never be erased from the map. Neither side can predict or impose on others the ultimate outcome of negotiations, and any final agreement has to be voluntary and acceptable to both sides. Now, so people might look at this and say, well, it's biased towards the Palestinians because it's using contentious terms. I wouldn't choose that title. I think that was poorly chosen title, but actually so far it's very clear, Carter's very clear in his belief in Israel's right to exist and his affinity for Israel. But, basically the writing I've seen so far, I'm only like partly into it, is, what you'd expect from experienced statesman and diplomat, diplomatic language there, but also realistic language. Now, the current situation, Jimmy Carter's 99 years old. He's in very frail health. I'm not sure if he's even aware of what's happening at the moment. I'm not sure if he looked extremely frail at his wife's funeral. But I wonder what Carter would make of this current situation. Um, 20,000 dead plus, maybe up to 22,000. It has to be said that the Gaza health ministry is entirely controlled by Hamas, so it may be that they're exaggerating some of the figures. That has to be considered. Nevertheless, it is very, very obvious that thousands have died, and many of them are civilians. I mean, Hamas can do a lot of things, but they cannot have a child covered in rubble and make them an actor. That is reality. Civilians are suffering. Many of them are women and children. And also, it shouldn't just be assumed that every single Gazan male is a member of Hamas, because they're not. There was images a while back that showed dozens of topless men from Gaza on the back of an Israeli truck, and ostensibly ready for interrogation. Um, that looks like collective punishment. Now, I'm not naive. I'm not there. Israel has went through its worst terrorist attack ever, and it would be the equivalent, bearing in mind Israel's a small country. Imagine if the United States, instead of 3,000 people dying on September 11th, it had been 50,000. That would be roughly the proportion of what's happened in Israel. So I do think it has to be understood what that has done to the Israeli psyche. There is a sense that they're being surrounded by enemies, and now Hezbollah is escalating things. I wouldn't be surprised if a new war breaks out on the border with Lebanon, like a full scale war, which would really, really test Israel's, even as a powerful country, that would really test Israel's um, resources. Um, but what's happening right now? Israel, according to a report on Michael Holmes on CNN, has stated that 8,000 Hamas fighters have been killed. There's no way to verify that. That's what Israel claims. It may be, but how can they even verify that? They will know roughly how many Hamas fighters there are, and there may be ways of working out if someone's a militant or not. Clearly, if someone is found in the rubble with a balaclava and, you know, with their hands near a missile launch, that's a fighter. But the problem with the Gaza Strip is the fact that Hamas, as is well known, as all terrorists do, they hide among the civilians, and that it does give a very difficult situation for Israel because, and I've said this before, this is what people need to understand. When you have a terrorist group firing rockets at their civilians, at Israeli civilians, and they're hiding behind civilians, it puts Israel in a very difficult position. Having said that, and this is something I have a big problem with, and this is why I say Israel's going too far. At this point, Israel is even bombing those sites where it's told people to go. That includes refugee camps, it includes so called safe havens, and it's no longer good enough for Israel to say, oh, but we're giving warnings. I mean, where the hell are these people expected to go? And there is a more sinister speculation going on, which is actually Israel isn't simply trying to defeat Hamas. They're actually trying to purge the entire Gaza Strip. They're trying to force the entire population out. Israel will never admit this, of course, but that's looking plausible because this bombing campaign is just unremitting. And it doesn't matter what caution they say that they're taking, it's very clear that civilian casualties are mounting every day. Apparently 50 yesterday. That's happening every single day. So I don't think it's good enough for Israel to say, oh, but we give warnings, we tell people to evacuate. Because where are they supposed to go? It's like telling people to go out of the fire into another fire. That's where Israel is, I think, wrong. They can't say, oh, but we've got this disclaimer, we're telling people to leave. Hamas, of course, doesn't give warnings. But that's, to me, that's, a nation state putting its standards on par with a terrorist group. i.e., well, it's okay for us to kill civilians because we're given warnings. Hamas doesn't bother. But I think as a nation state, Israel has much more responsibility to take caution. I mean, the countries that back Israel see Hamas for what it is, a vicious terrorist group that deliberately targets civilians, you know. And I do see a difference between Israel and Hamas. But if Israel continues on this course, firstly, they're not going to defeat Hamas, no matter how many they kill, because what it's going to do is increase radicalization in the region. Now, as Carter says, the warring parties cannot be left to themselves to have a peace agreement. This is too much mistrust, there's too much hatred. And frankly, even if there's Palestinians who don't like Hamas, they're not going to love Israel either. In fact, they might end up hating Israel. So what might actually happen is Hamas will be replaced. Maybe Hamas will be destroyed, but it will be replaced by another Islamist group. Because the Palestinians will say, my entire family was killed in an Israeli airstrike, so I'm going to gravitate to this group. I think some people have taken the attitude that the Palestinians would sort of rise up against Hamas or something. But it doesn't always work that way. In the first Gulf War, Bush Sr. Encouraged the Kurds to do that against Saddam, and they were slaughtered. So, in an ideal world, the Palestinians themselves would get rid of Hamas, but it's not happening. And the thing about Hamas, I think it reminds me a little bit of the cartels in Mexico. They're vicious and they're brutal, but they're not stupid in the sense that they have enough manipulative power to keep at least a large portion of the people on their side, in the sense that, they have the supplies, they will siphon off the supplies, they have those tunnels, they can blackmail the Palestinian people and the Gazans. They will say, for example, these evil Israelis are bombing you, we'll give you the medicine, so I think they can manipulate it in that way. But basically, it's a no-brainer. The more civilians that die, the more Israel will be despised in the region. It's a no-brainer. And yes, there are double standards. There isn't the same animosity held towards Bashar Assad when he was slaughtering Syrian civilians. There isn't the same animosity held across the region. I do think there is double standards when it comes to condemnation of Israel. I've always said that. But that doesn't mean what Israel's doing is okay. I do think at this point, it is looking like collective punishment. The Israelis can say they're just going after Hamas, but when they're bombing even safe havens, what are people supposed to believe? I mean, yes, there probably is Hamas fighters there, but if they're going to use that argument, then Hamas is throughout the entire Gaza Strip, right? So it then follows that Israel, in theory, would have to wipe Gaza off the face of the earth to destroy Hamas. And in order to do that, they would have to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of people. There is a case to be made that Arab states should be doing much more to help the Palestinians rather than just, condemning Israel. I mean, why isn't Egypt taking more refugees in? So much for the Ummah, this idea of collective Muslim brotherhood. But if Israel is sort of thinking of bombing Gaza into submission and just basically people moving out, then frankly, it will start to look like ethnic cleansing. There's no other way to look at it. So on say nothing I said at the beginning of this conflict. I think what Hamas done on October the 7th was horrendous. And I think Israel has a moral right to go after Hamas. I also think they've a duty. The Israeli government has a duty to protect its citizens. So the idea that Israel should have just done nothing is preposterous. I also think that a lot of these pro-Palestinian demos, there's unquestionably Hamas sympathizers, and that's grotesque. Absolutely grotesque. But I also think we have to be careful not to get into a situation where all condemnation of Israel is deemed to be pro-Hamas. I've noticed Israeli officials get very defensive about this. They called for Antonio Guterres to resign, and he clearly condemned Hamas. I think Israel needs to be careful because right now they've got no friends in the Middle East. I know the Emir of Kuwait, Qatar, is offering to get involved in negotiations. But let's be honest, Israel is lonely in the region, and now it's polarizing even its allies because there is growing disquiet in the United States, in the UK, in Europe. Israel shouldn't be complacent that Western governments will just continue supporting it without question. And I think this is the arrogance of the Netanyahu government. Also, within Israel itself, there's growing anger against Netanyahu's government. Um, that case a while back where the three hostages were shot by IDF troops, well, there's no excuse for it. Those men were clearly unarmed. They were clearly showing that they were hostages. That makes me think there's some trigger-happy IDF troops out there. It would not at all surprise me. But these were Israeli citizens. Now, that's only going to make Israeli people feel that the IDF isn't competent to deal with this. And that actually, I think it's one of the most advanced militaries in the world. But I think because of the exceptional situation this is, because of the strength of feelings and the level of violence there is, I do think there will be trigger-happy IDF troops. Now, to be fair to the IDF, senior commanders have clearly reprimanded troops who were seen looting, for example. So the IDF does hold itself to different standards than Hamas, without question. You'll never hear Hamas commanders saying to their fighters, "Oh, leave women and children alone." So there's absolutely different standards. Nevertheless, even in professional militaries, you get you get bad apples. It's happened in the British Army. It's happened in the American Army. So those IDF commanders have to hold their troops to account. And the troops who fired at those men were clearly hostages. They were in Hebrew. I mean, that's just unfathomable. And I'm not saying it's an easy situation for Israel, but that to me is a no-brainer. This wasn't like they were killed in an airstrike. This was, they came out. Um, there was families of the hostages who heckled Netanyahu recently at a Knesset during a Knesset speech. And of course, it shouldn't be forgotten before all this began, Netanyahu was facing huge protests to resign. Netanyahu is and remains a deeply controversial figure in Israeli politics. And I'm not sure that, I mean, on one hand, people might say, well, he's a strong man, you need a strong leader at times of war. Their violence. So I wonder what the situation would be if a more moderate Israeli government was in power. They'd still have to take action against Hamas. Any Israeli government would have to do that. But I do think Netanyahu is a problem, and I do wonder what is the strategy here in the Gaza Strip. Um, you know, they could kill thousands of Hamas fighters, but what happens next? Unfortunately, you can't defeat terrorism by bombs alone. I'm not a pacifist. I believe there's times that military action is absolutely justified, and I think after October the 7th, unquestionably, Israel had a right to go after Hamas militarily, without question. But at this point, what's happening? It's just bombing Gaza without mercy. It's telling people to evacuate, they have nowhere to go. It's bombing safe havens. And frankly, at this point, Israel is starting to look like a villain. And I'm saying that as someone who, despises Hamas. And also, I can see the problem of this mentality that Israel, from the river to the sea, is a call for the elimination of Israel. I also think it needs to be understood when people judge Israel that there is a sort of siege mentality there, in the sense that this is a small country that is looking like it's surrounded by people who want to wipe it off the face of the earth. But Israel cannot go down the path of basically collective punishment, treating all Palestinians as the same as Hamas. And I do think Biden and Sunak and other Western leaders need to be more vocal in condemning this. They've expressed concern about civilian casualties. But I actually would go to the point of saying, if this continues, if civilian casualties continue to mount, we're going to withhold funding. We're going to withhold support, because this cannot continue this way. or tell Israel to change its strategy. Um, but Israel's in a very difficult position. I don't think anyone should assume that Israel could just easily end this. And the thing about a ceasefire, I'm kind of gravitating now towards it being a ceasefire, but what would be the point of a ceasefire if it means that, okay, there's a ceasefire and then maybe a temporary lull in the violence, but then Hamas just continues firing rockets? It's in their constitution to wipe out Israel. So a core part of this problem is Hamas. I mean, it's kind of like poking a lion. Imagine Israel as a lion, comparatively speaking. It's pretty powerful, right? In the region, it's a small country, but you can't poke a lion and not expect to get bitten. So this is why Hamas is so despicable, because they knew that Israel's response would hurt the Palestinian people. It goes to show that Hamas doesn't give a damn about the Palestinian people. Because if Hamas really wanted peace, they wouldn't have it in their constitution to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. They would not be deliberately firing rockets at Israeli civilians. Let's be clear, Hamas isn't attacking the IDF. It isn't firing rockets at military barracks. It's firing rockets at Israeli civilians. Israel's response is to bomb Gaza into smithereens. It's also killing a lot of civilians. And whilst I don't think it's comparable, one is a response and one was an initial attack, I do think Israel's going too far. And my concern as a supporter of Israel is its actions are polarizing it. I don't think you could defeat terrorism by simply bombing it into mission. I think, yes, go hard against Hamas commanders, but there's no easy answers to this. But I am convinced that the more civilians who die, the harder it will be to have any resolution in this region. And, if it's a choice between, okay, you have some Hamas commanders in this refugee camp, do nothing and, risk those commanders firing rockets, or bomb it and kill 50 civilians, frankly, I'd go with the former. Why? Because Israel does have the Iron Dome defense system. So it can still defend itself with that. In fact, in those situations, I think targeted assassinations would be much more practical. Why not have those IDF troops on the ground engage them directly? That way, you've got lower civilian casualties. After all, Israel now has a ground invasion, more or less, so use it. In fact, I've said that that would be preferable to the bombing campaign. I know that's a controversial thing to say, but I think a ground invasion is likely to have less civilian casualties than this bombing campaign. I mean, it's like the bombing campaigns in World War II that just had mass civilian casualties. That's what's happening right now in Gaza. I think it's better that there should be more focus on this ground operation. Um, I mean, I have huge sympathy for young Israeli soldiers. That is, those who are not, abusing their position. Their casualties are mounting as well, but they are ultimately soldiers, and that's what they're there for, is to take on Hamas terrorists. I think the focus should be on that campaign. This bombing campaign, that's something I have a big problem with. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. It's already a bit too long, but there's a lot of things to consider with this. Let me know your thoughts.